of course, of this mobilization is the demonization of the enemy. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, in every war, the enemy is demonized. But, but, and that may be true. But it's again, it's a question of degree. For instance, if we were to look at conflict in the 17th or 18th centuries, or even the early 19th century, we simply don't find the degree of cultural demonization in most conflicts. Not, I can't say this applies in every case, but in most conflicts, we don't find this degree of demonization that we find in the 20th century. And let me just give you one practical example. Let's say we go to the Napoleonic period, so the first 10 years or so of the 19th century. Even though nations like France and Britain are perpetually at war with one another during that time frame, one can still find examples of the exchange of ideas and travel between the two countries. One can find collaboration in an academic or scientific context between the two countries, even in the context of the Napoleonic Wars. You're not going to find such examples of collaboration between enemy nations like that in the First or Second World Wars in a more totalized context. You simply, you're not going to find in the Second World War, oh, well, here are some Nazi scientists going to visit their counterparts in the physics department at a university in Britain. It's inconceivable. So we do find these distinctions, these cultural distinctions. But it shouldn't be surprising that because of the sort of visceral quality of this demonization of the enemy in the 20th and even, dare I say, 21st century context, that genocide should play such an important role in warfare, because it's only a few short steps from complete demonization of the enemy to complete destruction of the enemy. Right? Once the demonization of the enemy really finds its way into the minds of individuals on a mass scale, it's very easy then to direct those individuals toward a policy of genocide, or at least to find that people will not challenge a policy of genocide that may be visited against opponents or perceived opponents, even in the context of 20th century conflict. Now, in the case of the First World War, we really only find one example of a genocide that sort of fulfills all of the criteria of, for instance, the United Nations definition, and that of course was the genocide of Turkish Armenians that was perpetrated by the Ottoman Turkish regime. Uh, but but nevertheless, the conditions of total war, and especially the conditions in which the Ottoman Turks found themselves by 1915, really made this genocidal effort possible, and not just possible, but likely or probable. And so this is where we find a special relationship between genocide and total war. Total war uh, opens up the doors for genocide and increases the probability or possibility that genocide may occur because of the more general context of demonization of an opponent or of a perceived opponent or group which is seen to pose some type of existential threat to those who end up perpetrating the genocide itself. So we're going to then see how this unfolded in the context of Ottoman Turkey in the middle part of the First World War. Let's then turn to the context and motives that underpinned the Armenian genocide in 1915 and 1916. And remember that motive is an important factor in our definition of genocide and in our categorization of genocidal crimes. So, by way of background and geographical context, If we look at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, which we see on the map here of Anatolia, that I've borrowed from the Nyberg textbook, you can find that map on page 118. Um, the Armenian subjects in the Ottoman Empire lived mainly in the northeastern part of Anatolia, close to the frontier with Imperial Russia and also with Persia. And there had been long-standing tensions between Armenians and the Ottoman regime, particularly as a function of the Christianity of the Armenians and the fact that Ottoman Turkey was a Muslim empire. This was not something new at the time of the First World War, but remember that the 19th century was the age of nationalism, and during the 19th century, Armenians, on balance, became more nationally conscious and were agitating at times for sort of sovereign status or separation from the Ottoman Empire. And at the same time that this was happening, of course, Ottoman Turks were becoming more nationalistic, particularly in the decade leading up to the First World War. And in the context of this growing sense of modern Turkish nationalism, suspicions of Armenian treachery became more and more pronounced, even if they were generally ill-founded. And it's not surprising then that in time of war, in late 1914 and early 1915, that the Ottoman regime would begin to view its Armenian subjects with increasing suspicion, particularly because of the proximity of the Armenian Turkish population to the Russian frontier, and the fact that there were also Armenians living on the Russian side of the border who were serving the Russian regime in the armed forces of Imperial Russia. So there was suspicion from the Ottoman side that Armenians could not really be considered loyal subjects, especially in time of war, and that they had to be looked at with extreme suspicion. Now, it's difficult to say to what extent individuals living in the Armenian community were interested in fomenting any kind of rebellion or something of that nature on behalf of Imperial Russia, but that didn't really matter because the Ottoman administration had already convinced itself that this was the case, and it developed into what sort of became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there had been some ethnic clashes between Christian Armenians and Muslim Turks in northeastern Turkey in the early part of 1915, and it looked as if or it looks from the benefit of historical hindsight at least, that the regime in the context of this tension was simply looking for an excuse to persecute Turkish Armenians. So, for example, in April 1915, the 20th of April, a band of Turks surrounded the Armenian community of Van. Van is not marked on the map that Nyberg has used, so I've put a red circle approximately where Van was situated, sort of in the tri-border area between Turkey, Persia, and Russia, so there was a Turkish siege against the Armenian community in Van, which the Armenians, maybe not surprisingly, resisted with armed force, killing a number of Turks. And this then was held up by the Ottoman government as a clear illustration of Ottoman of Armenian treachery, which had to be answered with further violence. And I think most historians today seem to agree, at least from my reading, that this was simply a pretext, that the regime provoked Armenians by attacking this community, And then when the Armenians defended themselves, the regime said, "Oh well, here, this proves our case. We can't trust this community. They're going to engage in treacherous behavior. There will be an uprising. They will go over to the Russians, and we simply have to secure the border area and visit repressive measures on the Armenian community." So almost immediately there were a series of arrests of leaders in the Armenian community who were viewed as the so-called ringleaders of this treachery. So I'm talking about journalists, professionals, business owners, priests, and so forth, academics, and so forth, and numbers of them were arrested and murdered, shot to death under the cover of darkness. And then the violence only became more pronounced, violence like this against Armenians only became more pronounced after the Western Allies opened up a new front on the Gallipoli Peninsula to try to force their way through the Dardanelles Straits and bombard Constantinople, hoping to force Turkey out of the war. So this made the Ottoman regime feel even more insecure because on top of now being engaged with the Russians in the northeast and with the British on the Palestine front, they were further engaged with the Allied forces who were landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula. And it seems that once the Gallipoli campaign was underway, the intent of the Ottoman regime to destroy completely the Armenian population was effectively cemented in place. So then we find that this was essentially the climax of this buildup of tension between Armenians and their Turkish neighbors inside Ottoman Turkey, and that the regime used events like the defense of Van to show that in fact the Armenians were disloyal because they had fired on their Turkish neighbors, and then the Gallipoli landing said, "Oh well, this was the last straw. Turkey now was fully under assault by external forces, and any internal threat, however much it may have been imagined, had to be completely crushed." So in this context of a total war situation, where the Turks are engaged in what they feel to be an existential struggle on a series of fronts, there's little difficulty turning to what we might call total solutions as far as the relationship between the regime and the Armenian community was concerned. So trying to trace out the process of the Armenian genocide is not all that simple. It was not a tidy process or one which was necessarily neatly orchestrated from one central authority. And in fact, this is a feature of the Armenian genocide which is highly comparable or usefully comparable to the murder of European Jews by the Nazi regime in the Second World War. Now, there are many differences in the approach to the destruction of Armenian Turks and European Jews. But one of the interesting similarities or constants between these two situations is the degree to which localized improvisation played a role in the absence of absolutely clear written directives from senior authorities. So in each instance, it seems that the general intent of the regimes was well understood by actors on the ground, but that it was often left up to actors on the ground to improvise and pursue the policy of destruction in their own way. In general terms, the genocide sort of on a mass scale began with the expulsion or deportation of Armenians from Turkish Armenia, but from all throughout the central part of the Ottoman Empire, in sort of a general